The men and women who are charged with keeping every one of us safe are feeling the hammer of those who say it's they who are the aggressors in our city streets. The Obama Justice Department disagrees. And once again, Ferguson, Missouri is the national flashpoint. The time has come to stop pampering those who seek to make any portion of America their personal law-breaking playground. For that, we look to Oregon and the people some would call freedom fighters, others would call domestic terrorists. As the presidential battle shifts to South Carolina, there is growing discussion of the cable network that is seeking to change the course of this nation on their own. And now they are being exposed as nothing more than fair and balanced frauds. Oh, and speaking of frauds, Bernie Sanders is proving to be more than just a kind-hearted old guy seeking your vote. He's crossed the line and cozying up to one of the greatest examples of race baiting in America today. So let's get down to business. I'm Ed Berliner. This is The Hard Line for Thursday, February the 11th, 2016.
Ferguson Police Department's violations in particular were expansive and deliberate. These violations were not only egregious, they were routine. They were encouraged by the city in the interest of raising revenue. They were driven, at least in part, by racial bias, and they occurred disproportionately against African American residents of Ferguson. And they were profoundly and fundamentally unconstitutional.
It is much more than this simplistic sounding word, reform. There is not one single doubt something needs to change in every American town and city when it comes to law enforcement being able to do their job. But are we on the verge of a presidential administration seeking to make the federal government the law and order and take necessary power away from cops seeking to do their job, while at the same time failing to address a population that is more emboldened every day to break the law and be allowed to get away with it? Or is it possible cities are running from their appointed duty, that of doing everything they can and they should to protect every single citizen? We got a lot to cover. First up, he is a former police officer in Atlanta, Georgia, current attorney and author of Observations of White Noise, an acid test for the First Amendment. Welcome back, Marc Harrold. And we're joined in studio now by the former assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Florida, now with the firm McDonald Hopkins in West Palm Beach, Florida, Bruce Reinhart. I want to, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us because we got a lot to cover here. The Department of Justice filed a civil rights lawsuit against Ferguson less than a day after the city said, no, we will not agree to overhaul our justice system as the government wants us to do. First of all, Bruce, let me come to you. From a legal standpoint here, does this strike you as something the administration needs to do, should do, could do, has the right to do? Where does this fit?
Well, they had to. They have the legal right to, and they had to. As you remember, there was the incident in Ferguson, and then the Attorney General flew out there, and then there was the investigation and the report. And they had gone way out there in public saying there's all sorts of unconstitutional behaviors here. They tried to reach an agreement with the city. The city refused to agree. What were they left to do? They had to do something, and this is the way to force the issue. When
you are forcing the issue like this, what kind of juice is it? And this is the Department of Justice, let's be honest here, but what kind of juice? How quickly can they make something happen here? How big is this hammer?
It's a big hammer, but not soon, if the lawsuit plays out. I mean, this is a way to get leverage on the city, but if the city just stands back and actually litigates this to the end, it'll be months, if not years, before you get an order. Then you'll just have an order from a judge that has to be enforced. And then you start to confront lots of questions about, can the judge order them to raise taxes? Can the judge restructure the government of a local municipality over the will of the people who live there? And those are complicated legal issues. So this, if it plays out in the legal form, is a long, long fight.
All right, Mark, let's go ahead and turn to you when it comes down to the actual law enforcement side of this, because this is something that we've talked about an awful lot on this show here in the past. Because the city says, absolutely not. 10 months of negotiation, we're not going to do it. You're forcing our taxes to be raised. Our people can't pay for it now. We're going to have to pay our cops more. But wait a minute now. What does this say to the cops in Ferguson, Missouri? The guys and the gals who are doing their job. I mean, are they being told basically that you're all under this same umbrella right here? You're all bad cops. You've all got to change everything you do?
Well, you know, to some degree, to file a suit like this, you're going to have to show extensive patterns and a history of these types of abuses, or at least practices that aren't constitutional or don't meet the Department of Justice standards, at least. So, yeah, to some degree, they're going to have to paint the entire criminal justice system there in Ferguson with a broad stroke, or it's not going to, you know, if it's an isolated instance or two or some rogue cops, you're not going to bring this kind of suit. Look, I completely agree with Bruce. They were boxed in at this point, and anything that they backed away from, if they would have continued to negotiate after they thought they had a deal, and then Ferguson says no, votes it down 6-0, anything they would have come back from would have caused them to lose face. So I don't think it's surprising at all that they filed suits so quickly.
Let me ask about Department of Justice standards. Obviously, it is their job to make sure that every citizen of the United States is treated absolutely fairly by every single cop, every member of law enforcement, no matter who they are. But what about local standards? And I'm going to be very careful as I touch on this right now, because some cops I've spoke to have said the federal government has no idea what we do, how we work, and how we need to work in order to police our communities. I put it to you first here, Mark. Is that true, or is that just a convenient excuse?
It's both. It can be a convenient excuse when folks don't want to at least meet constitutional standards. Also, local municipal departments do have a point that sometimes federal authorities don't have a full view, but some of what was brought out here, and of course, I have no way of knowing exactly what part of the report was true and is not, but when you talk about something like they're going to have an agreement so that officers have probable cause before they arrest someone, something like that is a very, obvious constitutional standard for probable cause for arrest. So if we're talking about these types of basic things, then it may be being used as an excuse. But if the idea is that the federal authorities don't understand policing in every single municipality throughout the United States, I think there's some truth to that.
All right, Bruce, let me talk about that here, because when it comes down to what happens in the municipalities, again, there are some people who will say, we know better than the federal government does. But isn't that what the government is supposed to do? And I'm going to try to play both sides here. Their job is to make sure that everybody follows the line and does it correctly. And is it not fair to say that there were instances here in Ferguson that made the federal government stand up and take notice and say, you guys have gone over the line here. We got to bring you back in line with what law enforcement and policing is supposed to be in America.
Of course, and I agree with Mark. There's the big lines, right? Where does the Constitution say the lines are drawn? And there's obviously things you can't do. And so it's easy to reach an agreement, as Mark says, where you say simply, we won't violate the law. No one can disagree with that sort of an agreement. But it gets into the details. And oftentimes the details of how the police enforce the law depends on local customs and the way that local behaviors occur.
Local customs and behaviors, explain that, because there's a lot of people right now who would say, wait a minute, that's a pretty broad brush.
Yeah, what I'm talking about is they know their communities better than we do. They know when they're talking to informants, they know when they're conducting investigations, when they're conducting surveillance. They know what the people in their community feel is acceptable and not acceptable once you're on the safe side of the constitutional line. Because just because the law allows you to do it doesn't mean the police should do it. So there's oftentimes things that the police could do, but a community won't stand for. And they know that, but the rest of us maybe don't know that. So it's drawing those lines gets very hard when you get down into the details.
Mark, what's acceptable and what is not acceptable? Bruce just brought up something very interesting into the conversation here right now. Because does that not leave the officer themselves to make what could be, again, very broad brush strokes here? Because either it's acceptable or it's not. That's going to confuse a lot of people, don't you think? That seems to me as something that would even change policing. The cops are going to have to be much more hesitant about what they do.
Well, you don't have to hesitate in all instances, but policing does have a large degree of discretion to it. There's no doubt the minimal constitutional standards have to be met for every citizen nationally in every municipality, state, and the federal government. But, looking past that, there is a lot of discretion. I completely agree. There's also the issue of policies. Just as he said, something may be objectively reasonable, for instance, under the Fourth Amendment, and it may be an objectively reasonable search, but it could just be a practice that particular department decides not to engage in. For instance, the Supreme Court said you can use certain types of ruses to get consent to enter a building, but you don't have to do that. So a lot of it's discretion, but it's not completely just at the officer level. It's also the department level, and even state constitutions can come into play also.
So where do we then take that, Mark? Knowing what the DOJ is after here, knowing what we've seen in a lot of departments right here, how do you make that discretion? What's that line? Because you do have communities where, quite frankly, let's be honest, there's a lot of crime in certain areas. And also, as I mentioned, coming in, we have a lot of criminals who are out there saying, hey, I can get away with a whole lot more right now because I've got the DOJ, I've got the Supreme Court, I've got the courts on my side right now. I can basically go ahead and do whatever I want to do. There is that sort of thinking out there, Mark. So how then do we cut that line and make that hard line on discretion?
Well, I think it's in this instance in Ferguson, I think it's advisable for all the parties if they can come to an agreement. I think the last thing you want to do is get a court involved here, because I agree it's not clear what they're going to do on the back end of this and how long it's going to take. Of course, Ferguson's a much smaller community than we see a lot of these agreements come from. When you're talking about a major police department with more means or a state police department, Ferguson, I think, made this decision basically saying we can't pay for it. Even if we wanted to do all that, we can't pay for it. And that's where their city council came down. And of course, those are elected leaders at the local level, so they're going to be the most responsive probably to the tax budget, not wanting to raise taxes.
Bruce, there are people out there, and you know it as well as I do, who will look at this and say, this is the government coming down heavy-handed on local municipalities. This is the government trying to tell us how to run things. What do you say to those people who say that this is the tip of the iceberg? Even though the DOJ has done this before, they've been in other cities before, they've gone after other municipalities, but those who say this is the government trying to tell us everything that we need to do, and we're not going to stand for that.
I think the answer is, at some point, that's the government's job. If you're violating the United States Constitution, the United States government needs to defend you from those violations. So in that respect, good. Again, when you get into some of the details, should the Department of Justice in Washington be micromanaging
That's the
a
question.
police department? No, they shouldn't be micromanaging, but let me give you an example when I was talking about lines and I think what Mark's talking
15
about.
seconds.
Yes. One of the issues here is stopping people for broken taillights and things like that. You could have a policy that says you can stop someone for that, but you can't arrest them. You can give them a citation, but you don't take them into custody. That's what I'm talking about, where you don't have to go up to the line and still you can achieve what you want at the local level.
Mark, about 20 seconds. What was said right here just now about that specific item, about not going after these ridiculous, piddling little things, isn't that really where this settles right now? We got to get past that.
Well, we got to get past it, and we don't have the time. And a lot of that just comes from the idea that the subjective intent of the officer doesn't matter, not what he's thinking. It's objectively reasonable. And that line of cases came basically because of the drug war and headed down that path. But I agree, there's a lot to this, and we'll just have to see. But I don't think the court is the answer here. Hopefully they can come to an agreement.
We need to come back and do this all over again. Marc Harrold, it's always a pleasure to see you, my friend. Thanks for joining us. Bruce Reinhart, thank you so much for coming into the studio. Trust me, this isn't going to go away anytime soon. If Hillary thinks she got roughed up in New Hampshire, wait till the bus turns west, heads for Nevada. That and a whole lot more around the dial with Jerry Doyle when the Hardline continues.